All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here and everybody for watching on Marshfield Community Media. Thank you for attending tonight's meeting, Program for Public Information, and CRS Committee meeting. So this is the board for or the committee for the CRS committee here in PPI committee in Marshfield. Next slide. Great. So today we're going to be talking about the CRS program, flood insurance, changes in flood insurance, and also in town on some in flood compliance, as well as some other flood-related topics. And what is CRS? You'll hear us talk about CRS throughout the presentation tonight. It is the community rating system. And what is the community rating system? It is a program in which the town does things such as this outreach here tonight to get points, and those points accumulate, and everybody in town with a National Flood Insurance Program policy receives a discount on their flood insurance. And so CRS has several goals, right? To reduce and avoid flood damage to insurable property, strengthen and support the insurance aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program, and foster comprehensive floodplain management. So the activities that Marshfield does within the CRS program helps to ensure that those goals are met. So currently, Marshfield has a CRS class rating of 7. That means we have over 1,500 points or more, and that means everybody that has a flood insurance policy is receiving a 15% discount. And with changes recently to the flood insurance program, those discounts for the high risk and low risk zones, that's divided up there between the 15 and 5%, is actually no longer a division. It's all 15% throughout the community. So our goal is to get to a class 6, which we're certainly on our way to doing. Marshfield has been in the program in and out since the 1990s, where we were as high as a 20% discount back in the mid-90s. And so because of this outreach, as I mentioned earlier, and others that we do like this, Marshfield will continue to increase our CRS class rating. So tonight we're going to talk about the history of the National Flood Insurance Program, what is a flood, risk rating 2.0, insuring your property, looks like that got cut off a little bit, mitigation you can take, what to do in a claim, and some resources available to you. Next slide. So the program was started in 1968. And the reasons for the program are various, but basically there were many flood disasters happening at the time, and the flood program would allow private and public entities to share the risk of flooding, and then ability over time to facilitate reasonable rates. So the goals of the program: increase flood insurance coverage, identify flood-prone areas, those are the flood maps, and then require communities and homeowners to participate in order to receive federal assistance. Congress has established the NFIP, therefore it has to be updated, and that date, September 30th, is clearly wrong, but it keeps getting kicked down the road, so we now have another update that we need to have done by November 17th, and then that I'm sure will change to September 30th of next year. And so as the program is tied, as long as it's tied to federal funding, then the program will continue, that date will continue to be kicked down the road. So what is a flood? Well, as defined by most of your flood insurance policies out there, a flood would be a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land, and you can see the rest of the definition there. Very simply, though, what a flood is water that comes over the land from off of the land onto your land. So it's coming over the ground. That would eliminate burst pipes, water coming in from the roof or ceiling, and all that type of stuff. And there it is, water coming over the land from off the property onto the property. That is basically the simplified definition of what a flood is. So, flood insurance program recently changed. There's changes in the program. So the legacy system had certain rating elements, and then the new program has, under risk rating 2.0, definitely has different elements that go into the rating. But overall, the recent changes to the flood program mean that it's a total redesign of the rating structure. It delivers rates in FEMA's words that are fair, clear, and meet current industry standards, which for the most part they do now align with private industry. It's no longer binary, it's a graduated system that correlates with real-world conditions, and it's no longer rated based on zone and base flood elevations. So now the NFIP rating system is totally different. Looks like the screen is compressing some words, so apologize for the way that looks. So basically, some of the major differences that would impact people here in town under the preferred risk policy, which has gone away in the legacy system. You were able to buy a flood insurance policy that was cheaper depending on if you were in a low risk zone, and it had a set coverage amount. Under risk rating 2.0, though, those policies are gone. If you have them, they're grandfathered, and that's because rates will just be based off of the conditions of the property, based on wherever you are. So sometimes they're cheaper than the old PRPs were. They were a set PRPs were a set price and a set coverage amount, and then some will be higher. So the PRP is gone, but you may get a better rate now, or you may not. FEMA estimates about 70% of PRPs will be more expensive. Yes.
Will they be still transferable?
Yes. No, that's totally doable. Transfer. Yes. So that's a great point. So because of the nature of the change, they're now grandfathered, and you should assign them to new owners. If they're going up in price, they will still continue to go up in price, but the new owner won't lose the glide path that they're going up in price, which is very important for a lot of these policies. Great question. Next slide. Elevation certificates. Elevation certificates were required for most new construction and could give beneficial rating to other structures. Based on elevation, other structures based on elevation. So, for example, if you had new construction in town, we still require elevation certificates because this is insurance, and the building department will still require them for new construction. So all insurance, two separate things, but for the insurance side of the house, elevation certificates were required for all new construction, and under risk rating 2.0, now they are not required to get an insurance rate, but they are still suggested and could be beneficial. So we still suggest that you get an elevation certificate. And CRS, as I mentioned, the changes earlier with CRS in the legacy system, if you were in an X zone, you could actually not get the CRS discount, and now under risk rating 2.0 in an X zone, you can get the CRS discount. That is basically the biggest change, which is great for those looking to purchase policies in the X zone. So that would be your low risk zones. Oh, Greg, I think okay, good. And then mitigation. This is something that I think is really important, especially here in the town of Marshfield, with elevating mechanicals, because in the legacy system, there was no benefit to bringing your mechanicals to the next higher floor. So from basement to first floor to second floor. Now under risk rating 2.0, there is a benefit. It's a somewhat small discount, but if you're doing work and you want to save a little money and you want to get your utilities, especially out of those basements, onto your next higher floor, you will definitely want to consider elevating them because they do give a smaller discount on your flood insurance policy. Flood vents still give a reduction, but it's certainly a smaller reduction than was given in the legacy system. And on the table, and I have more in my bag, are a guide to the different types of flood vents that will give you discounts on your flood insurance. So those are on the table. Next slide. Here are some things that will not be changing under the new program. I'm not going to go through all of them, but things like I mentioned earlier, floodplain management requirements. If you're building in a high-risk zone, you will still require an elevation certificate because that is a floodplain management rule, not an insurance rule, even though insurance now doesn't care whether you have one or not, although it can still be helpful. So things like that. So these are all the things that are not changing. And again, on there, as I just mentioned, the assignment of a flood policy to somebody new, if they're buying your house, actually is probably more important now than ever. So that is still something that has not changed from the legacy program to today. Impacts of the program change. Well, the program, Risk Rating 2.0, this new program from FEMA that changed all the rating, went into effect already. All policies are in the program. Therefore, this has already happened. But it's good to see that the impact, a lot of people said, 49% of policies were going to go up and some higher than others. But in the legacy system, all policies were going up in price, and when we transitioned to the new rating system, some policies actually saw decreases in their premiums. So that's actually was a benefit for 39% of our Massachusetts residents. And you can see I actually was able to break down the Marshfield numbers, and 319 people saw a $100 a month decrease in their flood insurance once the program started. So yeah, that's a pretty good. Now, of course, 884 saw no change to a $10 a month change, but that's still pretty good considering that's probably less than what they would have seen as an increase under the legacy system. So it was still really good numbers. Next slide. And then private flood is also an option. Private flood comes from markets that are considered non-admitted or admitted. So non-admitted markets does not mean they're not allowed. It just means the state doesn't regulate the rates. So that's why you hear companies going way up in price. It's typically because they're non-admitted and they are allowed to go as, whatever they want to do with pricing, they're allowed to do. The biggest non-admitted company we all probably know of is Lloyd's of London. There are also reinsurers taking risks, but mostly commercial. And admitted programs also exist, but not many. And there are now also endorsements to homeowners policies. Next slide. Okay, so insuring your property for flood. FEMA estimates 40% of losses come from low-risk flood zones, and your homeowner's insurance will not cover flood damage. Well, that's actually a fairly big misnomer that I hear, that their homeowner's policy will cover flood. Flood coverage can either be purchased from the federal government or private insurer, as we just talked about. And then a separate policy may have to be purchased, or you might be able to get an endorsement if your homeowner's carrier is also a flood provider, which is not many. Contents-only insurance is available for renters, and not many people buy that type of coverage. And for most policies, there's a 30-day wait if you're buying an NFIP policy. However, look at those numbers at the bottom when we look at the difference between a Harvey payout from the NFIP during Hurricane Harvey and a Harvey payout from disaster assistance. It's a very big difference. So flood insurance had a big impact there. Next slide. Deductibles. We get a lot of questions about deductibles. Now, we can't advise anyone on what deductible to take, but if you're looking at saving money, a higher deductible may be better for you. And if you want to, take a lower deductible, do that. But just note that the more claims you file, the more expensive your flood insurance will be, no matter who you purchase it from, including the National Flood Insurance Program. And that was a change made during Risk Rating 2.0, where claims will now affect the premium. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. What's covered, again, I'm not going to go into super big detail on this, but there's a bunch of stuff in here about what is and isn't covered. Next slide. For a building basement or an area that, for building coverage, you're going to get your foundation walls, air conditioners, drywall, in for walls and ceilings. And when I say in basement only, what that means is if you have a crawl space or an enclosure, you wouldn't get that coverage, but you would in the basement throughout the house, but specifically that's in the basement. Non-flammable insulation, again, if you have a basement, that's where that would be covered versus a crawl space or enclosure. Electrical outlets, fuel tanks, and the fuel in them, believe it or not. Furnaces, water heaters, heat pumps, sump pumps. So basically, if you have a basement, you've got a decent amount of building coverage. Next slide. And you can see that when we talk about an enclosure or a basement, this is what is being classified as having that limited coverage, right? So in a basement, you'll have the coverages. In the crawl space or enclosure, you might not. But then you would also have your washer dryers, food freezers, and portable and window air conditioners in the window and plugged in. That's important to note. But that's all you would get for contents coverage in a basement crawl space enclosure. So through the rest of the building, all that stuff plus more is covered. But in those areas, that is the limited coverage that you would get. So there's a list here of things that are not insurable, but the bottom line is cleanup and debris removal is covered. I had seen someone recently that had two feet of water in a totally empty basement and a $30,000 claim just for cleanup. So cleanup is definitely covered. It's a big deal. If you buy a flood insurance policy, sometimes that's the only reason you'll ever file a claim is for cleanup and debris removal. And it can be cheap, believe it or not. Through all the press about an expensive flood insurance policy, the average cost of a flood insurance policy is $1,000. If you live in a floodplain, there's a 26% chance you'll have a flood versus a 9% chance of a fire. So, those high-risk zones, there is definitely a higher chance of a flood than fire, which is pretty unbelievable. And then, we say 30%, 40%. The number is hovering now probably closer to 50% of all claims are coming from the zones that are not mapped by FEMA. I mean, think about what's happened in just Western Mass this year. It's, you got none of those areas I can tell you were mapped for as high-risk zones. So talk to your insurance agent. And because of the changes in the Risk Rating 2.0 program, an insurance agent really has to be the one to talk to you about insurance because of how specific it is. And we do have a guide for real estate professionals. You can pick one up at the town hall. Okay, what to do in a claim? So this is where we talk about permitting here in town. If you are doing any type of substantial improvement or substantial damage, there is a process you have to go through in order to be able to rebuild. Now, when we talk about this is where the building department comes in, where if there's any type of substantial improvement, which is the same as substantial damage, because in order to be substantially improved, you can either, you want to do a kitchen, you want to elevate your home, you want to do some type of major work in your house, that is substantial improvement. But if you're substantially damaged, which means 50% of the building's market value in damage, the only way to get repaired is by substantially improving. So they're basically the same. One's caused by damage, one is caused by you needing to do the work to your home or wanting to do the work to your home. So, if the cost of reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvements to a building equals or exceeds 50% of the building's market value, then the building must meet the same construction requirements as if you were building new. So we have examples of this coming up in a moment. Substantially damaged buildings must also be brought up to the same standards. And then not complying, we now have the floodplain permit here in town where any type of work on the floodplain must be permitted through the floodplain permit. And by doing that, you're basically helping the town understand whether you could be substantially improving or repairing a substantially damaged building. Yes?
That first paragraph you just read.
Yes.
Has to fall into now the construction requirements building new.
Yes.
Does that also fall into the new energy stretch bill that took effect in January?
That would be a bit, so this is regarding your elevation. So this is just talking about elevation. I'm not sure whether the energy requirements would be enforceable on that as well. And I'll give you an example. if you want to redo your kitchen and say you have a $100,000 home and the kitchen is going to be a $70,000 kitchen, just as an example, that would be a substantial improvement. And if you're in a high-risk zone, this requirement would make you elevate your home to whatever the height elevation requirements are for that area, as if you were new construction.
But that's what I mean, new construction has to follow that stretch bill.
Correct, yeah.
If there's now an overlap, now that's going to fall into.
That would be definitely something Andrew Stewart would be able to answer, our building commissioner, because I'm only familiar with the floodplain code, so that would be something he'd have to answer.
I know, I know who we get.
Okay, cool. That's a good question, though. I'm not sure how that would relate to this. So, but in terms of floodplain requirements, what happens if you have a substantial damage is that the damage is done, storm, fire, whatever it is. The adjuster sends a claim estimate to the community basically saying, insurance companies will kind of know the value of your building. They'll have a rough idea of if you might be substantially damaged. Then the resident goes and applies for the permit to reconstruct, and at that point, the community official has a rough idea of it. It could be substantially improved. They'll ask you for all the documentation. The community requests a detailed estimate of the work, and then the building official, which in our community is Andrew Stewart, would make the determination on if you're substantially improving or substantially damaged and then substantially improving. So, storm documentation. So even if a claim is not filed, you should document storm damage to your property or your area. The Marshfield Police Department does that. They send a drone out before each storm, but you should do that to your property as well, because that can actually help, because photos and descriptions of damage can help both community officials on filing for FEMA assistance, and also you to understand the types of damage your area can receive and be better prepared for that. This little graphic, this presentation's on our website, on the town website, so this is a great graphic just to keep around, kind of tells you what to do after a storm. And again, what I like to say on this slide is it seems very intuitive, but the problem is that during a storm and it's all very chaotic, having these reminders is really helpful. And another good one, so this is kind of a before, during, and after. So, make an inventory before, right, blue sky days, as they call them, right? Don't wait for the storm. Avoid walking or driving through floodwaters. I mean, some of these are common sense, but in a storm and things are crazy, right, you'll want to. And I think the number one thing is after the storm is to document the damage right away. I saw an individual one time replace items, took the adjuster a week to get out there, which in a big storm can happen. And in that time, they had already replaced the electric baseboard heat in the house that had been damaged. No receipts, no pictures of what was there before, and the adjuster could not accurately pay him for the replacement and the damage. So it's very important to take those photos right after before you do anything else. Next slide. Mitigation. So, rating can depend on foundation elevation. We kind of talked about that earlier. Different zone requirements for require different foundation types for new construction or substantially improved buildings. Different foundations affect costs differently. So the higher you elevate, the lower the cost. And with risk rating 2.0, go back one. Sorry, Greg. Oh. Looks like you went really far forward. Okay, here we go. Thank you. So thank you, Greg. So basically, in the NFIP requires that a state or community elevate their homes to the flood elevation as stated on the map. But in states and communities that enforce the International Building Code, which Massachusetts does, you have to go a foot above the stated elevation. So you can see there, the lowest floor with a vented enclosure and the utilities there, and then that's an A zone. In a V zone, of course, you've got the big elevated buildings with the enclosure below. And Risk Rating 2.0 put out this very complicated mitigation grid if you want to know what your impacts will be. And it's tough to kind of follow, but the bottom line is the higher you go, you can see the discounts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they do it by foundation type, and then they do it by the height you are from the ground against the building. So floodplain requirements are height above the flood elevation. Insurance requirements or benefits are height above the ground next to the building. So, for example, if I was to take a crawl space and elevate it 5 feet from the grade next to the building, then my discount would be 34% off of what I would be paying on insurance had I built a crawl space right at the ground level, so essentially a slab. So it's really just good to know this grid is, like I said, it's a little complicated, but it starts to get you familiar with the different requirements. And in Marshfield, we have the benefit of having a map information service available at the building department. If you go down there, they can tell you your zone, your elevation, the base flood elevation, if you're in a CBRA, and if you're in a wetlands area, and they can also help you identify what you could do. We have this new program where the building department will help you identify ways to mitigate your property, and then also help you actually make a site visit to your home and show you how you can mitigate against flood. So that new program can be found at the building department. Just ask the building commissioner, Andrew Stewart, about how the building department can help you with that. And here's a list of contacts and websites. And I guess the bottom line here is don't lose your investment. Get flood insurance now before the storm. So that is our presentation. If there's any other questions, I know I moved through that pretty quickly. I don't know if there might be any other questions or comments from the audience or any of my panelists here today. Okay. Greg, any questions? He's coming out.
No questions, but you might want to just remind the two people who sat here, there are a number of slides that we had to show to get the CRS points.
Yes, thank you. So some of the slides here were required to be shown to get the points, but some of them were also here to help you, to benefit you and help you with any insurance questions you might have. So I guess with that, I'll wrap up tonight's presentation. I appreciate everybody being here and watching on the Marshfield Community Media, and have a good night.
Thank you.
You're welcome.